Hello, class. So we're trying something a little different today. The district wants us to reduce screen time a little bit. So in order for this to actually work and spend less time staring at the screen, I would suggest just listening to it. You can put it play on your computer, have it your headphones in, or be in the same room, and just listening to me reading the story. And then when pictures come up and things, I'll tell you. But this isn't a picture book; it's a chapter book. So I'll be reading about 15 minutes or so each day. And then after a set of chapters, there'll be a little comprehension check just to make sure you're continuing to understand the story and following along. So at the end, you can take an AR test on it and get some AR points. This is one of my favorite authors from when I was about your age, Roald Dahl. He's most famous for Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, but he has a bunch of great books. They're often quite silly and amusing, and George's Marvelous Medicine is no different. I do need to make a disclaimer. I'll say it a lot. Do not make anything that George is talking about at home. In the real world, what he's making would be considered a poison, not a potion. So this isn't something we're going to copy, but it is a book that we'll read and laugh at together. Make some predictions, all sorts of great stuff. So just based on the cover, we can already make some guesses that George will probably be this main character. Maybe you'll make some guesses about what he's going to do in this story based on our first picture. Chapter 1. Grandma. I'm going shopping in the village, George's mother said to George on Sunday morning. So be a good boy and don't get into mischief. Mischief is like trouble. This was a silly thing to say to a small boy at any time. It immediately made him wonder what sort of mischief he might get into. And don't forget to give Grandma her medicine at 11 o'clock, said the mother. Then she went out, closing the back door behind her. Grandma, who was dozing in her chair by the window, opened one wicked little eye and said, Now you heard what your mother said, George. Don't forget my medicine. No, Grandma, said George. And just try to behave yourself for once while she's away. Yes, Grandma, said George. George was bored to tears. He didn't have a brother or a sister. His father was a farmer, and the farm they lived on was miles away from anywhere, so there was never any children to play with. He was tired of staring at pigs and hens and cow and sheep. He was especially tired of having to live in the same house as that grisly old grunion of a grandma. Ooh, that's some nice alliteration. Do you hear that G sound? Grisly, grunion, grandma. Looking after her all by himself was hardly the most exciting way to spend a Saturday morning. So already, what are we thinking about the grandma character? I mean, I've read this story before, but based on her first reactions, she doesn't seem to like George very much. You can make me a nice cup of tea for a start, Grandma said to George. That'll keep you out of mischief for a few minutes. Yes, Grandma, George said. George couldn't help disliking Grandma. She was selfish, grumpy old woman. She had a pale brown teeth and a small puckered mouth like a dog's bottom. Ooh, that wasn't very nice. Hopefully he doesn't say anything like that to his grandma. But that's not a very nice comparison, huh? But it does give you a good picture of what she might look like. How much sugar in your tea today, Grandma? George asked her. 1 spoonful, she said, and no milk. Most grandmothers are lovely, kind, helpful old ladies, but not this one. She spent all day, every day, sitting in her chair by the window, and she was griping about something or other. Never once, even on her best days, had she smiled at George and said, Well, how are you this morning, George? Or, why don't you and I have a game of snakes and ladders? Or, how was school today? She didn't seem to care about other people, only herself. She was a miserable old grouch. George went into the kitchen and made Grandma a cup of tea with a tea bag. He put 1 spoon of sugar in it and no milk. He stirred the sugar well and carried the cup into the living room. Grandma sipped the tea. "It's not sweet enough," she said. "Put more sugar in." George took the cup back to the kitchen and added another spoonful. He stirred it in again and carried it carefully in to Grandma. "Where's the saucer?" she said. "I won't have a cup without a saucer." She doesn't really say please or thank you, huh? She kind of treats him like a servant. George fetched the saucer. "And what about a teaspoon, if you please?" "I've stirred it for you, Grandma. I stirred it well." "I'll stir my own tea, thank you very much," she said. "Fetch me a teaspoon." George fetched her a teaspoon. When George's mother or father was home, Grandma never ordered George about like this. It was only when she had him on her own that she began treating him badly. Why do you think that is? Why would George's grandma wait till his mom or dad are gone? Yeah, maybe so that the mom or dad would stand up for him, or that she doesn't want the mom or dad thinking that she's a meanie, or knowing that she's a meanie. "You know what's the matter with you?" the old woman said, staring at George over the rim of her teacup, with those bright, wicked little eyes. And so here's a picture, if you want to look at the screen, of George and his grandma and her sitting in her chair sipping her cup of tea. "You're growing too fast. Boys who grow too fast become stupid and lazy." "But I can't help it if I'm growing fast, Grandma," said George. "Of course you can," she snapped. "Growing's a nasty, childish habit." "But we have to grow, Grandma. If we didn't grow, we'd never be grown-ups." This is one of the silly parts of this book. How can you stop yourself from growing? That's a weird complaint to have. "Rubbish," which is like a British word for garbage. "Rubbish, boy, rubbish," she said. "Look at me. Am I growing? Certainly not." That's a weird argument. Grown-ups don't grow anymore. It's only kids. "But you did once, Grandma." "Only very little," said the old woman. "I gave up growing when I was extremely small, along with all the other nasty, childish habits like laziness and disobedience and greed and sloppiness and untidiness and stupidity. You haven't given up any of these things, have you?" Oh, that's a pretty mean way to insult him. "I'm still only a little boy, Grandma." "You're 8 years old," she snorted. "That's old enough to know better. If you don't stop growing soon, it'll be too late." "Too late for what, Grandma?" "It's ridiculous," she went on. "You're nearly as tall as me already." George took a good look at Grandma. She certainly was a very tiny person. Her legs were so short she had to have a footstool to put her feet on, and her head would only come up halfway to the back of the armchair. "Daddy said it's fine for a man to be tall," George said. Could you imagine if you stopped growing before you were as tall as your grandma? I'm taller than my grandma. "Don't listen to your daddy," said Grandma. "Listen to me." "But how do I stop myself growing?" George asked her. "Eat less chocolate," Grandma said. "Does chocolate make you grow?" It makes you grow the wrong way, she snapped. Up instead of down. Down? What does growing down mean? Grandma sipped some tea, but never took her eyes off the little boy who stood before her. So she's drinking her tea and staring at him. Never grow up, she said. Always down. Yes, Grandma. Stop eating chocolate. Eat cabbage instead. And if you haven't had cabbage, it's kind of like a thicker, tougher version of lettuce-ish. Cabbage? Oh, no, I don't like cabbage, said George. It's not what you like or what you don't like, Grandma snapped. It's what's good for you that counts. From now on, you must eat cabbage 3 times a day. Mountains of cabbage. And if it's got caterpillars in it, so much the better. That sounds pretty unpleasant, eating a bunch of cabbage filled with bugs. Here is Grandma telling George in a picture all about how he should eat cabbage instead of chocolate so he can grow down. She's got some weird arguments. Ouch, said George. Caterpillars give you brains, the old woman said. Mummy washes them down the sink, George said. Mummy's as stupid as you are. Ooh, she just insulted his mom, Grandma said, who was her daughter. Cabbage doesn't taste of anything without a few boiled caterpillars in it. Slugs, too. Not slugs, George cried. I couldn't eat slugs. Whenever I see a live slug on a piece of lettuce, Grandma says, I gobble it up real quick before it crawls away. Delicious. She squeezed her lips tight so that her mouth became a tiny wrinkled hole. Delicious, she said again. Worms and slugs and beetly bugs. You don't know what's good for you. Here is a picture of George looking at Grandma, imagining eating cabbage with slugs on it. You're joking, Grandma. I never joke, she said. Beetles are perhaps the best of all. They go crunch, which is a nice onomatopoeia, a sound effect in our story. Grandma, that's beastly. The old hag grinned, showing those pale brown teeth. Sometimes, if you're lucky, she said, you get a beetle inside the stem of a celery stick. That's what I like. Grandma, how could you? Find all sorts of nice things in the sticks of raw celery, the old woman went on. Sometimes it's earwigs. I don't want to hear about it, cried George. A big fat earwig is very tasty, Grandma said, licking her lips. Do you think Grandma really eats the bugs? Or do you think she's just trying to freak out George? A big fat earwig is very tasty, said Grandma, licking her lips. But you've got to be very quick, my dear. When you put one of those in your mouth, it has a pair of sharp pinchers on the back end, and if it grabs onto your tongue with those, it never lets go. So you've got to bite the earwig first, chomp, chomp, before it bites you. George started edging towards the door. He wanted to get as far away as possible from this filthy old woman. You're trying to get away from me, aren't you? She said, pointing her finger straight at George's face. You're trying to get away from Grandma. Little George stood by the door staring at the old hag in the chair. She stared back at him. Could it be, George wondered, that she was a witch? He had always thought witches were only in fairy tales, but now he was almost sure. Come closer, my little boy, she said, beckoning to him with her finger. Come to me, and I will tell you secrets. George didn't move. Grandma didn't move either. So we'll stop here for today, and then we'll keep going tomorrow, and eventually I'll let you know when there's a quiz to go with what we've read so far, just to kind of check to make sure you're understanding the book.